Back from break, everyone. My name is Sam Stankovic. I'm the head of market access for Insight Biosciences Canada, and I am moderating this session, which is called PMPRB Pricing, Navigate the New Pricing Landscape to Solidify Your Market Access Plans. Joining me today, I have an esteemed panel representing a few different sectors of the industry, but I'll start with myself. In case anyone's wondering, Insight Biosciences Canada started operations in April of 2020, just at the start of the pandemic. So just as everyone was locking down, Insight was establishing an operation here in Canada. I'm employee 2. I joined in August of 2020. And Insight Biosciences has 3 products approved by Health Canada currently. And we invest quite heavily in R&D in Canada. We reported to PMPRB for the last 3 years a cumulative total of $100 million on a very small base of sales. We're still waiting for widespread market access on our products to be covered. So that's Insight Biosciences Canada in a nutshell, but I'm going to pass it to each of my esteemed panel one by one to introduce themselves and say a few words about their organization. So I'll pass it to Joan.
Joan McCormick. I work for IQVIA. I do PMPRB consulting, and we definitely don't have enough time for me to tell you about what else IQVIA does, but by all means, let me tell you later at the break.
Lauren?
And I'm Lauren Fischer. I'm the Government Affairs Lead at AbbVie, and AbbVie is innovative biopharma, and we have offices in both Markham and Montreal, and we're over 100,000 people strong in Canada. Pleased to be here.
And I'm Ryan Locke, Director of Federal Affairs and Public Policy with GSK here in Canada. We have deep roots in Canada dating back to 1902. Dual head offices in Mississauga as well as Montreal, and we have a vaccine manufacturing plant just outside of Quebec City, and it's great to be here.
Great, thank you very much for your attendance today. I know we organized ourselves prior to today's meeting, so the objective of this session is to have the audience understand each of your organization's position on the pending PMPRB guidelines and the potential impact on drug prices, access to new therapies, and healthcare innovation in Canada. So to start off, what I thought we'd do is we'd ground ourselves into what we heard this morning from the Director General, Guillaume Couillard, who's still here, I think. And I'm going to take us all the way back to 1987, which was, by the way, 20 years after the Leafs won the Cup, last won the Cup. So just want to throw that out there. I know Andre was looking for a joke earlier. So not that that's a joke, but I think what's really important is to understand that the latest consultation, which was due September 11th this year, resulted in, I read 59 submissions, but I think Guillaume mentioned over 60. So I guess the first question I want to ask the panel is, how did we get here?
Thanks, Sam. I will do a quick trail through history. I won't go all the way back to 1987, but if I go back to 2015, which is still pretty far back, we can see that Trudeau's just come to power, and he gave his Minister of Health a mandate letter that included reduce the price of drugs, make drugs affordable. And that was pretty strong language that the PMPRB took to heart. And that leads us to the story over the next few years. We saw draft regulations published in 2017. We saw some significant court decisions coming down in the subsequent years, which, one interesting comment from the Quebec Court of Appeal was that the question isn't whether the PMPRB, whether drug regulation is a good idea, whether lowering drug prices is a good idea. The question is whether the PMPRB has the authority to be in control of lowering drug prices. And the answer back from the courts was that no, that's provincial jurisdiction. So the result of the court decisions was that the regs were narrowed and the mandate was reinforced. Now, while all of that was going on, the chair of the board completed his maximum term with the board. So we've got a vacant chair spot, and we've got some direction coming from the court. And as the board tried to adjust to all of this, there was 4 different sets of draft guidelines issued at various points in that evolution, culminating with the last set of guidelines, which led to the board acting chair resigning. And that was a pivotal moment in PMPRB history. And after that resignation, another member resigned. We also saw the retirement of the executive director. So lots of change. And the result is, as Guillaume was telling us this morning, that we have an entirely new board now. The last two members have now completed their term, so all of the people are newbies, so to speak. It's a fresh new generation. So how did we get here? Things are changing. It feels different. And in fact, this morning's presentation, Guillaume, I didn't say anything, but other people have come up to me and said, Joan, it felt different. It feels different. And I agree with you. It feels different, partly because we've got different leadership, and partly because the mandate letter that we saw come out in 2015, the 2021 version, the most recent version of that mandate letter, doesn't mention lowering drug prices anymore. They're doing lots of things at Health Canada, but they're no longer looking to lower drug prices. So they've heard the message, and it is different. So that's why this feels different. We've got a fresh approach, and they're taking a different tact.
Thanks, Joan. So I'm going to pass it to Lauren and ask her, what feedback did AbbVie provide in this last round of consultation that was due in September?
Yeah, so first off, I'll say that AbbVie and the industry were really pleased to have an opportunity to offer thoughts and input to the PMPRB in their latest consultation. It kicked off in December with a scoping paper, an opportunity to provide some early feedback, and then there was a discussion guide that was published in late June, and we were offered the opportunity of written feedback and also interaction with board members on the discussion guide. In terms of feedback that AbbVie had, I'll point to kind of three key things that we recommended as part of the consultation process. One of them was related to guidelines that are being developed needing to respect the PMPRB's mandate, which is to ensure that there aren't excessive patented drug prices in Canada. And from AbbVie's perspective, price levels that are below the highest price in what is a new price reference basket sit outside of a mandate of excessive pricing. The PMPRB sits alongside other agencies in Canada that play the role of establishing what is value for pharmaceuticals in Canada. So we make submissions to INES and Canada's drug agency. We negotiate net prices with the PCPA, and those are the organizations that are there to determine what is value and what's value-based spend for drug plans in Canada. The PMPRB's role is separate and apart. So that was one key point that we made. The other relates to a recommendation to ensure that there's predictability and voluntary compliance. In looking at this latest version of the framework at PMPRB, we're somewhat concerned that the PMPRB is kind of moving away from predictability and voluntary compliance to some extent, in that there will be the potential for case-by-case reviews by PMPRB staff looking at the pricing factors in the Patent Act. So we're encouraging the PMPRB to ensure that there's predictability and voluntary compliance, because it's just so important for our planning for the launch of new medicines in Canada. And the final thing that I'd like to point out that we mentioned in our consultation input is just the importance of technical working groups with industry experts. These have been used actually very effectively by the PMPRB in past consultations to kind of work through challenging operational questions. And we'd encourage the PMPRB to reconsider that kind of format, because in generating new guidelines, there will be a number of complex operational issues. It's really important that the guidelines be workable.
Thanks, Lauren. Picking up on that point, Ryan, were there any particular recommendations from the industry that you feel that PMPRB has not yet adequately addressed?
That's a good question. So if we look back at the June discussion guide, there were, from GSK's perspective, a number of topics that were canvassed in the discussion guide that did not come as a surprise to us, and I'll touch on what those are. But then there was one area in particular that was very much surprising, and I think to answer your question, as an area that remains still to be addressed, we want to see some rethinking there. But in terms of the elements we were hoping and expecting to see at this stage of a consultation process that's really been going on for quite a number of years now, it was encouraging to see that the board continues to earnestly reflect on implementing a complaints-based process for vaccines, or what I might characterize as a lighter regulatory touch for vaccines. I think everybody in this room would recognize that vaccines are an important public good, but additionally, vaccine pricing is quite well controlled in Canada. We have amongst the lowest net prices for vaccines in Western countries, and we have a very effective and long-standing tendering system that the federal government runs on behalf of provinces that does a nice job of controlling vaccine prices. So again, it's encouraging to see that the board in this latest consultation document continues to acknowledge that as a pathway forward. I think we were also looking at the document at GSK, encouraged to see consideration being given for some mechanism for inflationary price increases. Of course, that does trace back to the Patent Act, and it's encouraging to see that the board pulls that through. We've just been through, all of us would remember well, a very marked period of high inflation in Canada, and our industry is certainly not exempt from that. Whether it's input costs, labor costs, et cetera, things have gone up considerably, and it's encouraging to see that the guidelines would consider some mechanism to reflect and capture that. But I mentioned a moment ago that, and your question was what's not addressed. There was a surprise in the document, and that's the new approach that's being floated around legacy products, or what was formerly characterized as grandfathering. It's a marked change in approach being proposed by the board with respect to how legacy medicines launched before 2019 would be treated. It's kind of a shadow of the former approach in that the board is proposing that there could be some temporary form of grandfathering, but after a relatively short period of time, the prices on medicines launched before these reforms began and were sort of blessed by cabinet and ensconced in regulation, that all of that would be up for grabs again. For any of you who've looked at our GSK's submission, it's great bedtime reading. We've characterized this in our submission as the disappearing grandfather trick. What happened to grandfathering? It remains an unanswered mystery that we'd like to get to the bottom of. I'm making light of it, but there's important questions of fairness and predictability that are at the root of that.
So just to follow up on that point, what impact do you foresee with the potential new guidelines on new medicines coming into Canada?
So Canada and Canadians, all of us in this room, were in a very fortunate and privileged place in that for most of our companies, I won't speak for AbbVie, but certainly for GSK and many others, we are in Canada a tier 1 launch market for innovative medicines. And as I say, that's a very privileged place to be, and we definitely want to stay there because companies globally, with Canada being 2% of the global pharmaceutical market, decisions about launches and launch sequences are made with not just Canada or any one particular country in mind. They're taking account of all of these markets and how all of these puzzle pieces fit together. So it's critically important, we believe, and again, I think most people would also echo this sentiment, you want to be at the top of that launch sequencing and not somewhere in the middle or close to the bottom, because patients are waiting for access to these medicines. I'll just give a really quick example, and I'll use the example of our shingles vaccine, Shingrix. We launched that vaccine, and as a backdrop for this, 1 in 3 older adults are at risk of contracting shingles at some point in their lifetime. It's very unpleasant. We launched that medicine in 2019, mere weeks after the United States did, because Canada at that point in time was, and still is, a tier 1 launch country. What ended up happening not long after the Canadian launch was we ran into some unexpected challenges with manufacturing one of the components that goes into that vaccine. And that pushed back launches in a whole bunch of other countries by years. So China, for example, Chinese had to wait years to get access to that shingles vaccine. They have it now. But there's a huge difference between being at the top of that launch sequence and what can potentially happen if you're waiting because of government policy and regulations and consequences, unintended or otherwise, that push countries back later into that sequence.
Thanks, Ryan. And just thinking about the other side of that coin, I know Canada does represent a very small proportion of the global sales to any large international, but Canada actually punches above its weight in terms of RX&D spend. So the question I have for you, Lauren, is what effect could these new guidelines have on the potential RX&D spend in Canada?
Yeah, great question. I mean, maybe I'll just take a little bit of a step back, provide a bit of context, and then I'll get to an answer. A couple of weeks ago, actually, we had a scouting trip from our global R&D department out of Chicago. So they came up to Canada and they held meetings with a variety of biotech companies. They were really interested in finding new Canadian technology. And, the reason for this is that, there's been a huge flip in the last 20 years. So our head of R&D, who was at the session, he said, 20 years ago, the bulk of new technologies were developed in-house in our industry. That's completely flipped, and at AbbVie, actually, about 60% of new molecules that enter our pipeline come from business development. So it's called external innovation, and it's really fundamental to AbbVie, but also to the pipeline strategy of the leading pharmaceutical companies. It's how we make sure that we have a steady flow of new innovation for patients. And this represents a great investment opportunity for Canada. What our global R&D colleagues said when, coming out of their meetings is that they were super impressed with the quality of the science, the level of sophistication, and they actually announced a new partnership with a small Canadian biotech company. So we're investing in a new Toronto-based company. So this is kind of a backdrop, I guess, coming back to your question, what is the relevance of PMPRB to this? What our global team said is that, at the same time, we tend to gravitate in terms of our investment towards environments where our innovation is valued, where there's a predictable and timely path for our innovation to get to patients. And so in this sense, the PMPRB and its guidelines don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of the policy landscape in which our sector exists, and in that sense, they do influence the investment climate that we're in. And we believe that the PMPRB guidelines should reflect and be consistent with government policy that in the past number of years has put a very strong emphasis on growing and supporting the life sciences sector, so both federally and provincially.
That's a great response. I do like how it's not in a vacuum, and in fact, the ecosystem is really dependent on multiple agencies, including PMPRB. So I guess the follow-up question to that, it really is, how should manufacturers of patented medicines be thinking about preparing for the next round of consultation?
Yeah, there are probably a million different answers to this one, but I'll point to a couple of things. I mean, the first thing I would say is just participate, right? Set aside time to participate. The draft guidelines are coming, and I'd say make sure to set aside time when those draft guidelines are published to, read them, reflect on how they might affect your business, any concerns that you might have. We all have businesses to run. It's challenging sometimes to set aside this time, but they're important enough to do that. If you're a larger company and you're able to provide detailed technical feedback, that is terrific. If you're a smaller company and don't have the capacity to do that, at least if you can send in a one-page letter outlining your key concerns, then that's great too. So set aside time to participate. The second thing I would say is, be prepared that it may take a bit of time. The process of, coming to, what the PMPRB's final regime will be has been a fairly long one. We've been at it now for close to a decade. So we've been living with some uncertainty. But I would say this isn't the time to kind of rush the process. Rather, I'd encourage everyone to just be prepared to dig in and for a little bit of time and make sure that we get it right. The PMPRB's guidelines are a really important part of the policy landscape. The stakes are high for patients, they're high for the healthcare system, and they're high for our economy. So I think everyone involved should invest the time to get it right.
Absolutely. I think participation is key. Question to Ryan. Do you foresee any unintended consequences of the next set of guidelines that might be sort of a concern for manufacturers?
Well, I think Lauren touched on it very well just a moment ago, that the PMPRB guidelines don't exist in isolation, nor does Canada exist in isolation in the context of a global pharmaceutical market. One of the advantages of being a tier 1 launch country is, of course, access to new medicines faster, but another perhaps hidden but also very important advantage is from an economic perspective. It means that Canada can be prioritized in terms of placing clinical trials. And it's great that Canada today really punches above our weight in terms of being able to attract clinical trials from across the industry. And that's big. It's a big part of our economy, particularly in provinces like the Atlantic provinces that have really robust investment attraction strategies around bringing in new clinical trials and are doing a really nice job and, again, are punching above their weight. If the access environment were to inadvertently deteriorate, it makes a much harder business case to global to bring those trials there. I mean, think about it. Why trial a medicine if at the end of the day there isn't going to be an opportunity for patients to benefit from that? It's borderline unethical. So we need to be thinking in a very holistic way about all of these policies, the economic development, the life sciences, the PMPRB, the CDA, how all of that connects together. And I think, so to go back to Lauren's point, it's really important to get this right as opposed to get this fast, which isn't, by the way, me saying let's take another decade. But again, when so much is at stake, it's about really getting it right.
So we're getting close to the finish line. Joan, what actionable advice do you have for the companies and the audience today?
I guess I'd break it down into 4 different pieces. One, for industry members, you need to continue to build the bridge with your global pricing team so they understand how much Canada is going to be affected by international pricing. The second one is that you probably need to dig in and understand how those global markets work. Under the old regime, we had the US as kind of a protection umbrella over top of us. The US is gone. Now we need to dig in and understand these 11 markets and how prices change over time, because that's going to directly affect Canada. The next one is this new framework, if it goes ahead as planned, is going to allow the PMPRB to conduct a therapeutic class comparison at any point in your patented life. That's very different than just at introduction, the way we used to see it. So going to need to understand that. And to build on Lauren's point, that's something you can start looking at now and understanding better now so that you can be more engaged in the consultation process to help contribute to those discussions. Similarly, the last point, the board is saying that any time a drug goes into in-depth review, there's not only going to be a therapeutic class comparison, there's also going to be an international therapeutic class comparison. We have much less experience working with that. It's a fascinating test, but again, preparing to understand that and how it will influence that in-depth review is going to be critical.
Wow, a lot to think about before the holidays. We have time for at least one question, maybe 2. I'm going to go to the audience to see if anyone has a question of our panel. Okay, well, if you don't, I'm going to go back to Ryan with a question. Ryan, do you think the new guidelines will achieve the desired balance between their mandate for, I had controlling drug pricing, but we knew from this morning that's not the mandate.
Ensuring not excessive.
Ensuring non-excessiveness, thank you, and ensuring patient access to new therapies.
I sincerely hope so. And I'll go back to something you said a moment ago, Joan, which is that things do feel a little bit different around this consultation process. I think we're actually having a dialogue, and I think it's evolved into a consultation process, which isn't necessarily how many of us might have characterized it at different points along the way. And so I think through dialogue And through, forthright exchange of ideas and putting evidence on the table, we have a much better chance. We're within striking distance, let's say, of achieving that balance. I might not have given that optimistic assessment a couple of years ago.
Great. Last call for questions in the audience. I think we're at time, so I want to thank my panel today for their wisdom that they've shared with us. So please join me in congratulating them for a great presentation.
Thank you, Sam.